think all of us feel enlightened. I think yeah, it says a lot of things in our everyday life, you know. And it's interesting also to hear people's reaction. People in my group were hard on the girl, you know, because she reacted badly, right? Sometimes we feel, you know, she was so impolite in a way. But at the same time, if we think about our situation, I mean, in the American context, the white think they are, you know, they don't have an ancestry and they are the, you know, the American. Others are hyphenated. So in a way, it's like a dominant and the minorities. So I think the reaction also comes from that. But if you think back to our situation, then sometimes maybe we can understand why, you know, sometimes when the majority say something and the minorities could react so strongly. Yeah. So I mean, if I put that in the context of Malaysia, then I understand sometimes, you know, it's quite commonplace, this type of reaction. But whether, you know, we should react this way, yeah, there's another question. Actually, Debbie asked me to prepare something down to earth with a lot of stories, and so I try very hard to think of examples. But somehow my slide doesn't come out that way. So if you don't find what I say makes sense, please tell me and ask me questions. All right. Now, what is ethnicity? I'm asked to discuss a bit, you know, how to differentiate between ethnicity, race, and then what is racism. Now, is ethnicity culture, or is ethnicity language, or is religion important for an ethnicity? So sometimes when we look at the reality, it's very hard to sort of grapple, you know. Sometimes, especially in Malaysian context, we use very often the word race, right? But is Malay an ethnicity or a race? Is the Malay group, do we call it an ethnic group or is it a racial group? Race? Do you think Dr. Mahathir belongs to a Malay race? No, right? So I think in reality it's far more complex than that. So it's very hard to say whether it's a race or is classified based on culture or, you know, some sort of ancestry, even ancestry. If you think of the Malays, it's very hard. You have Thai blood, you have Chinese blood, you have Indian blood, you know. You have all sorts of mixture. So what is Malay race or Malay ethnicity? And so in that sense, for instance, you know, sometimes we say, oh, Malaysia is so multicultural. We should all not put importance on our own ethnic identity. We should all identify as Bangsa Malaysia. Does that help? I mean, for instance, you know, some Chinese fight so hard to keep Chinese school. If we don't have a Chinese education, do you think that the situation in Malaysia will be different? The dynamics? Possible? If, for instance, you know, now we know that we all eat food from different ethnic groups, right? Does that diminish the importance of ethnic identity? Does that? I don't think so. It's not because we don't eat Malay food or Chinese food or Indian food, then, you know, we keep our identity distinct, right? Even when we wear Malay clothes or, you know, other things, we use some cultural elements from other ethnic groups, but actually it doesn't diminish the so-called ethnic identity. You know, when you go to the Amanah Saham, you want to buy the share, you're still Chinese, you're non-Mubin Putra, right? So what is it that defines ethnicity? For instance, you know, does converting to religion make one less belonging to an ethnic group? You know, in history we talk about masuk Islam, masuk Melayu, right? That means that once you become Muslims, people will treat you as Muslim. But as Malay. Is that true? Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not true, right? So how do you define ethnicity? Actually, at one point in time, not in one point in time, even now sometimes, when you look at some scholars, when they analyze a society, they tend to say, okay, Chinese, Malay, Indian. So they treat as if they are static, you know. Chinese means Chinese, and they practice Chinese culture and so on and so on. And sometimes, at some point in time, anthropologists, when they study a society, they just make a whole list of cultural practices, customs of a society. But even in the 60s, one scholar began to propose that when you study an ethnic group, you know, it is not enough to, it's not to study a culture. It is to study the social organization of cultural difference. Okay? So ethnicity, a very simple definition is a social category of people assumed to share a common descent and culture. It doesn't matter whether it is real that you share a common descent. Just like, you know, the Malay people, they don't necessarily share a common descent, but they believe that we are Malay race, we are, you know. If you go to Indonesia, if you say Melayu, they look at Melayu only as one of the ethnic group among many ethnic groups. They don't regard all Indonesians as Melayu. Okay? But in Malaysia, because of the sociological context and political context, the Melayu actually assumed to come from all over archipelago. But it is the same, you know. You say Chinese, okay, we come from China. The ancestor come from China. But if you go to China, then Chinese is a nationality, right? And also if you say Han, then it is composed of many different ethnic groups. But here, Chinese is regarded as an ethnic group, right? So it depends on the context. The context is very important. And there, so it is what people think, that the subjective, you know, what you think is a Malay and what your community think is a Malay or Chinese, or, you know. So in that sense, the subjective dimension is important, but you cannot just say, oh, I am not, let's say, you know, I am not Chinese, or I am not Malay. But other people think you are Malay, or if the government thinks you are not a Bumiputra, you also cannot do anything, right? Even though you subjectively believe you are Bumiputra, but the other people don't recognize, then it doesn't help either, right? So there is this objective dimension, the social dimension. There are these two interactions with these two dimensions. Now, so ethnicity, I find still, even though it's, you know, he proposed this way of studying ethnicity in the 60s, but I think it's still very useful. It's called the social organization of cultural difference. That means that not all, let's say, if you're a Chinese, here you call, you know, we are Chinese. But not all the Chinese culture, you know, from China, they are important. You know, some cultural practices are important. If you talk about Chinese from America or Chinese from Canada, most of them probably don't speak Mandarin, right? But it doesn't stop them from being seen as a Chinese there. But here, if you don't speak Mandarin, very often some Chinese-speaking ones may look down on those who don't speak, right? So here, actually, socially speaking, is an important ethnic marker, all right? So it depends on the context how it becomes important. So probably the Chinese education movement and also this, how our society is, our history is, make it an important element. And now even, you know, the number of parents, Chinese parents, the percentage of Chinese parents who send their kids to Chinese primary school is still increasing. You know, it's now is something like 96, 97%. Yeah, but before it could be just 80%. That means there are some minority parents who think it's not important to know how to write Chinese. But now more and more. So it is an evolving thing. It's a dynamic thing. It's not a dead box, you know, where it never evolved. So there are just a few concepts that sort of try to understand this so-called social organization, cultural difference. So we have what is called ethnic boundary, and it's very tricky to draw this ethnic boundary. Yeah, and especially I think there were some cases like those indigenous or rather native people from Sarawak, their parentage is mixed, and whether they qualified to get admitted to Mara College, for instance. There are some discussion there, for instance. In Sabah, you need to have just one parentage, but by constitutional definition, for instance, a definition of a native in Sarawak, you need both parentage. But in practice, actually, when the father is or mother is a native, they pass. At the practical level, actually, they are allowed to be recognized to enjoy some sort of benefits. So there, it is the drawing of ethnic boundary, and it's also evolving. Okay, for instance, in the 1970s, when you have NEP, actually the Islamic department realized that there seems to be a lot of conversion from Chinese community. So they begin to investigate. It seems that this phenomenon happen more often among the lower social economic class Chinese. Maybe they see that as a form of social mobility. So they begin to say, okay, first generation, if you convert, you have to keep your surname. So because for the state, actually, how do they know whether you are Bumiputra, you are Malay? If you have a Muslim name, actually they just assume. Yeah, if you say you are Bumiputra. But if you keep that name, so you have something with the Tang and then Abdullah, then people through your name can recognize, say, oh, you are first generation. If you second generation, maybe if you marry a Malay woman, then that man's children can be considered Malay. Okay, so this is the way the state is trying to draw that boundary. Okay, and so the name become an ethnic marker. All right, and also, of course, ethnic practices. Normally you say cultural practices, but I think that here, it's not just culture. Ethnicity sometimes include religion, especially if the religion is an important ethnic marker or ethnic practices. And in the case of Malaysia, we know that very clear that there are surveys done among Malays that they think that their religious identity is more important than their ethnic identity. But this is not always so. So it is also dynamic and evolving. What is important in a cultural practice? My favorite case is the lion dance. Okay, in the 70s, 80s, our famous Home Ministry say, oh, these Chinese, they still want to perform lion dance. There is no lion in Malaysia. They might as well perform tiger dance with the traditional musical instrument. But it seems that according to some scholars, at that time actually lion dance popularity was declining, and it was a dying cultural activity. But after that, it became for instance, election issue. The Barisan Nasional lost in some election because of that issue. But also by beginning of 90s, according to that scholar, Malaysia became the biggest importer of lion dance apparatus from China. For China, we are the biggest customer for this type of apparatus. So you can see that. So lion dance become so-called very important ethnic practices to signify your Chinese community. You have the right. You have this cultural right to practice. Yeah. So this is an assertion of ethnic identity in a way. Okay, and that means that it gains certain political significance. It's no longer just a cultural practice per se. There is a political significance that it's an assertion we have the cultural right to practice our culture. Okay, so it is that makes a difference. So when you say social organization of cultural difference, then that become a very important practice. Not because let's say in terms of different cultural practices that is the most meaningful, but the meaning there becomes contextualized in the Malaysian context. All right. But we have to remember one thing. That means that I saw that some people were asking the question, why is it that in the past, when you say clean, actually there is no offense. But now when people say clean, it's a discrimination. Remove from Dewan Bahasa. But I think that is because of context. Because I think now what the Indian community felt, they felt marginalized in the national context. They face a lot of there is demolition of their temple, and there is this interreligious dispute and so many things. All right, so it creates a certain ethnic awareness which feel they are victim. It's a bit like the Asian in America, with a victim complex in a way. Sometimes the Chinese also, or when I read in the news, sometimes the way people react. So it's a form of victim complex, but then you react and you say, oh, they must be. But sometimes in certain contexts, it's true. When certain say clean, it is in a pejorative way, right? So in that sense, actually, you cannot blame them. You have to understand context. When you say this problem of the book, what is that book? The book by our national laureate, Interlock. I think it is the same in the sense that, some of the famous sort of literature written in outside our country, sometimes they also have, because to make it real, you feel you can really understand the particular context. Sometimes you use certain words they use, or sometimes the conversation can be racist and whatever. But in the context, it depends on whether the author tries. The author may not be trying to insult or trying to diminish the other ethnic group. But when the other ethnic group, especially in this context, read it, then they take offense. And also in school, when teacher read this and teach, what type of lens they are using to teach it. So it becomes a problem. So in that sense, then there is this interaction going on. It's very dynamic. So in that sense, then we have to understand each other's perspective. Actually, one interesting thing that I read, was an anthropologist. I think I told some people, I don't know whether any of you here. There was an anthropologist who came to study about anthropology of Islamic law in the 70s. So he went to the village, actually, and he stayed with the Malay people. And he was told that, in an official occasion, you should wear songkok and traditional Malay costume. And then he was taught also by the villagers, when you see a Muslim, you should greet him by Assalamualaikum. He was told that that is the most beautiful greeting he can ever give to a Muslim. Now, after that few years, he went back happily or whatever. In the 80s, he came back. He did some sort of update work. And he stayed with the similar area, but with different people. He was also get acquainted with the Qadi and so on. And one day he got into trouble with Special Branch. The Special Branch took him to the office, police station, and asked him, why are you using Assalamualaikum? Are you trying to proselytize? Are you have some ulterior motive to convert the Malay people? Because he's a white also. And the other conversation he had was with the Qadi. After some time, the Qadi told him, actually I think it's not proper for non-Muslims to wear songkok, because that is a Muslim thing. So you can see the change in the context. And if you have that context, and you know that there is this UIA maybe, some years ago about this convocation, and asking all the Malays, regardless of religion and ethnic group, to wear songkok. You can see both ways. You can say, oh, it's a national thing, but it's in the context, is it really so, or is it a power thing? You are in this institution, you have to respect all this. It's a bit like this, prohibition of non-Muslim religious activity in Mara College, for instance. Is it a power thing, or is it really, So there, I think that we need to be attentive to the context and how the protagonist understands the issue, and not make a big, we have to understand and try to mediate and not to be judgmental sometimes. You know, sometimes when we see the victim's reaction, sometimes we say, oh, you know, he is not integrating, or he is overreacting. But it happens, yeah? It happens. Now, what is race? It seems to be a simpler thing, right? A race, very often, you know, we say the black and the white, right? In Malaysian case, it's a bit more mixed up because we say Malaysian race, Chinese race, and Indian race, but also we say Malay, Chinese, and Indian ethnicity, right? So, are we a race or are we ethnicity? So, how do you determine race? Race, of course, the very simple thing is our physical sort of characteristics, right? So you can say we try to, historically, we try to categorize people by their phenotypical traits and physical appearance, such as skin color, the hair, facial feature, and so on. But there is a working definition. What about in reality? If we look at different countries, when you have intermarriages, so do you know, white and black. So is he a black or is he a white? How do you determine, you know? And, you know, the Aborigines in Australia, you know, when, in the 70s, for instance, when there was intermarriages and during the second generation, they said only 1/4 of the blood is Aborigines. They may get contaminated if they are brought up in an Aborigines culture. They even took them out from their family and put them in a white family. And now, of course, the government apologized for that, you know. But it was, of course, a big... But that is a consequence of racial policy. But it shows how, now, for instance, how do you define whether a person is Aboriginal people in Australia? Then, you know, it's saying one person who feels they are Aboriginals and is accepted by the community, you know, sometimes it's very hard to prove your descent because they don't keep record, right? So you can see that in reality, to determine that actually is very tricky. You know, for instance, in America, I think earlier times, for instance, if you are a few generations down of mixed marriage, then you can, so long as you are not a slave, you can pass as a white. But when, you know, it becomes very polarized and the South wants to control the slave, then they say even if you have one drop of black people's blood, you are black, you know. And it seems even in the 80s, there was one woman who has 1/32 of the ancestry, who is a black person, was contesting in court and said, I am not a black. She probably doesn't look black either. But it seems the judgment says you are a black person by this rule. Okay? So it's very hard actually in reality to determine your race. Because how do you determine? And if you look at different countries, actually it's very different. Alright? In Malaysia, of course, I think it's more, you know, if you look at definition, Malay people are people who practice Malay custom, Muslim, and also I think the other one, the language. Yeah. So in that sense, it's more cultural. So yeah. Now, so actually, so we can say that racial categories are not based purely on biological factors, but actually it's socially and historically defined. Yeah, and people fight over it. Are you a black? Are you a white? You know, are you Aborigines and so on. All right. And I think there is a case also in South Africa. The Chinese, the Asian community tried to, you know, change the definition of them in, you know, black or color or something. Now, so actually, then it becomes even more blur, right? You can't determine by biology. Is it the same as ethnicity? So actually, the racial category and ethnic category can overlap. For Malaysian case, it seems to overlap, right? But let's say in America, okay, you have black and white, right? This is by race. But within that white community, as you see, there are also different origins, and they would consider themselves Italian by origin or Greek or Irish, And at one point in time in America, for instance, the Irish were not considered white. In Australia, during the white Australian policy, for instance, they don't consider the southern Europeans who have black hair, as white. They considered the northern, golden hair and whatever. So actually, the definition changed over time. All right, but sometimes it overlapped with. Oh, okay, sorry. So I jump quickly. I think I said some, but I want to, maybe just 2 more slides, all right? So one point I want to say is, there is this personal thing. Actually, social category, then is it bad? Is it bad to think I'm Chinese? Is it bad to say I'm Malay? Actually, when we look at the reality, as somebody was saying, he was trying to figure out their origin so that you know how to interact, right? So actually, social category is very basic thing. We try to know a bit of your background, and then we know how to deal with you. How to start a conversation, what type of conversation. So it also constitutes some your identity. It's not just a thing that you can manipulate. But there is also this objective or social dimension to it, because then when you're a Chinese group, Malay group, then you have this interaction, and there is the other level of interaction. It's not just in person to person, but when you see in the media something happen, it's out of your control. But you can interpret it, but it has a life of its own. So it's not just a personal thing. We cannot just say we don't think like Chinese, Malay, Indian. We think as Bangsa Malaysia, all the problem will be solved. It's too simplistic. It doesn't work that way. All right. That's why I say even if you assimilate everybody, even for instance in Indonesia, the Chinese, they take away their name and they don't learn Chinese and so on. Still, during the Reformasi. During the fall of the Suharto regime, they got victimized. So no matter how much they assimilate, they are still considered a scapegoat, right? So it is a political thing. It's not a cultural thing. It's not a language thing. It is a political thing. Now I better move faster. So racism, I think you all know, but it's very, it's very, how to say. In reality, it's very hard, whether just now people were racist, people say it's racist, you say you shouldn't have stereotypes, and so on. Anyway, we can talk about it maybe at Q&A, but you have different gradations. Something in us, sometimes unintentionally it slips, because we are in a certain social setting, we are socialized to think in certain ways. Sometimes we realize, then we say, okay, I shouldn't say that. Even that man just now, you speak very good English for an Asian. I mean, he was meaning to be good. He wants to make a compliment, but the compliment is, So it happens. Now, maybe I end with this. We say, Ismail Sabri. They were supporter, right? They say, Je suis Ismail Sabri. We are all Ismail Sabri, right? Of course, when we read it, we say, I feel alarmed that, there is UMNO people who feel that it's not wrong to say racist things. But at the same time, I want to ask a question. Will we sometimes Ismail Sabri also? Yeah? But I think the difference between us and at an interpersonal level and him as a minister is that as a minister they should set an example. And if they make such a statement, they need to resign, in my opinion, because then we want to set the norm. Racism is everywhere, in the West, here and so on. But the difference is, in our country still, being racist is not really something very serious, depends. It depends. Whereas in the West, we say, oh yeah, they are also racist, etc., etc. But at the normative level, that is not admissible. Even they have laws sometimes to prosecute people who practice racial discrimination. But That, I think, is the difference. So racism is everywhere, but it doesn't justify it. But at the same time, I think that it's good to set the norm. And